They called it Valdombra, the village beneath the veil. Hidden deep within the folds of the Apennine Mountains, it clung to the side of a fog-soaked valley like a secret not yet confessed. No road marked its entrance, no map bore its name. And yet for 2 centuries, monks, merchants, and even kings whispered of it, a place where the dead never rotted, where bells tolled without hands, and where the night birds sang in tongues. Valdombra was last seen on the evening of March 11th, 1623. By dawn, it was gone. No fire, no plague, no sign of exodus, just silence, cold and immovably like. The earth had closed over it in shame. What remained was a letter, single letter sealed in wax blacker than pitch, addressed not to any man of power or war, but to Pope Gregory XV himself, its author. A young Dominican priest named Father Aurelio Dembrus, a man whose name had never before crossed the lips of Rome, but whose final words would chill the spine of Christendom. The letter was delivered by a blind shepherd boy who wandered into Bologna barefoot, mumbling psalms in reverse and clutching the parchment with bloodied hands. He collapsed at the feet of the city guard, weeping a single phrase over and over. The Virgin wept salt into the well. The Holy Office, upon reading the document, sealed it from public view. But fragments have survived, leaked by archivists, copied in secret by scribes, passed like relics through shadows. And from those fragments, a picture begins to form. Aurelio was not always a priest. He was once a child of Valdombra. In his youth, he described the village as a place where time walked backwards on Sundays. The snow never melted on the graves. His mother had been the village midwife, his father a stonemason who carved eyes onto statues long after the rest was done. It was not until the winter of 1619 that Aurelio returned to Valdombra, cloaked now in the robes of Dominican austerity and the ghosts of failed ambition. Banished from the seminary in Parma for speaking aloud to shadows, he had nowhere to go but home. But Valdombra was no longer the place he remembered. The villagers had grown silent, as if their voices were being taxed. Children wore amulets of bone and sang lullabies backwards. The church door, once always ajar, was now sealed with iron nails. And in the square stood a statue, one that Aurelio did not recall from his youth. It was a woman, tall and gaunt, with a veil of thorns and a child cradled in her arms, no face, just a smoothed over void where her features should have been. Locals called her La Madre Ascoltante, the listening mother. They said she had appeared one morning without explanation, standing where the well once was, her feet sunk into the stone like roots into soil. No one dared speak her name after sundown. Aurelio, though shaken, tried to resume his duties as a priest. He held mass, though few came. He offered confession, though no one dared kneel. He wandered the village by night, torch in hand, praying for signs not of demons or saints, but of reason. What he found instead were symbols setched behind shutters, carved into bark, drawn in ash above doorframes. A language that pulsed with repetition, spiral within a spiral, always turning inward. And then came the dreams. Aurelio wrote that he saw a woman standing at the foot of his bed, her veil dripping brine, her mouth stitched shut with hair. She carried a candle that never flickered, and when she opened her fingers, moths poured from her palms. Every night, she grew closer. Every night, the candle burned lower. And every morning, Aurelio awoke with salt on his lips and the smell of lilies rotting in his lungs. He sought answers from the villagers, but they only smiled a smile too wide to rehearse. Puppets mouthing someone else's prayer. Then, on the 27th of February, something changed. The statue wept. Drops of salt water ran from its eyeless face, pooling at its feet. Those who drank from the puddle swore they heard the voices of their dead, calling them into the forest. And one by one, they began to leave mothers clutching infants. Old men gripping rosaries, children humming funeral hymns. Aurelio begged them to stop. He read aloud from Exodus. He set fire to the foot of the statue, but it did not burn, only wept more. And so he turned to the only authority he had left, the church. The letter he composed was feverish, frantic, and laced with Latin incantations known only to the inner circles of demonology. He warned of a power older than Eden, a mother not of heaven or hell, but of silence itself. She does not want blood, he wrote, only attention. The last line of the letter is the most disturbing. If you receive this holiness, do not pray for us. Do not send help, only salt your doors. and never answer the sound of weeping from an empty well. The letter ends there. And when PayPal investigators arrived weeks later, Valdombra was gone. Not destroyed, missing. The mountain path where the village once sat now opened into a ravine choked with moss. No ruins, no corpses. Only silence and a faint scent of brine on the wind. But that is only the beginning. In the weeks that followed Valdombra's disappearance, the Vatican archives stirred with whispers not of angels, nor of devils, but of something far more difficult to name. Something older than doctrine and beyond the reach of redemption. The blind shepherd boy who had delivered Aurelio's letter never awoke. He died 3 days after his arrival, lips crusted with salt, eyes open and gazing toward a corner of the ceiling where nothing ever moved. But shadows gathered unnaturally fast. A delegation of the Holy Office was formed, a men in gray vestments, the kind who carried both crucifixes and flintlock pistols. Among them was Monsignor Adriano Corsini, a former Jesuit with a reputation for dealing with the unexplainable. He was said to have once exorcised a convent by burning the confession booth, and had a peculiar habit of listening more than he spoke. He led the expedition to the place where Valdombra had stood. What they found was not absence, but distortion. The trees were wrong, bent slightly inward, as if bowing to something unseen. Birds refused to sing, and the wind moved in spirals, curling back on itself like a serpent devouring its tail.
The ravine is there. Polished marble, cracked by time and pressure, bearing a mosaic of a woman veiled in thorns.
Beneath her, in Latin too, archaic to decipher entirely, was inscribed, "She listens only when forgotten." Corsini noted that the ground tasted of copper when the wind shifted, yet his men dig deeper. They found no bones, no foundations. Only more marble, more symbols, and, at the very center, a shallow basin filled with water that shimmered unnaturally even under shadow. One of the younger inquisitors, Brother Elio, leaned too close. The others said he whispered something to the pool, then screamed as if a choir of children were clawing at his ears. He died the next morning, his skull caved in from the inside, though there was no mark on his flesh. Corsini sealed the site. He ordered the stones covered again, the basin buried beneath salt and earth. But he made a private copy of Aurelio's letter, annotated in the margins with Latin counterincantations and glyphs borrowed from ancient Carthaginian rites. He understood, perhaps better than the rest, that what had occurred was not an exorcism gone wrong. It was an invitation answered. Over the following months, Corsini became obsessed with the listening mother La Madre Ascoltante. He traced her likeness not just to Valdombra, but to woodcuts from 11th century Bohemia, to the margins of heretical manuscripts, to a statue once unearthed near Alexandria, whose face had been deliberately chiseled off. Always the same posture, always the child in her arms, always the mouth without features. In one account from 1487, a Spanish monk described a woman without a voice, whose tears fed the forest, and whose prayers could not be heard by God nor devil. He claimed she was worshipped by a sect that believed silence itself was a form of creation, that by refusing to name something, one gave it room to grow. Corsini's final journal entry, dated the night before his death, reads simply, "She does not speak. She listens until we unravel." He was found in his study drowned, but there was no water in the room. It's only a small bowl of salt at his feet, and a single moth perched on his tongue. What is most troubling, however, is what began to happen in the villages near the original site of Valdombra. Shepherds claimed they heard lullabies from dry wells. Infants were born with mouths sealed by soft membranes. And in dreams, always dreams, a veiled woman stood beneath the stars, cradling a child that never moved. One account, preserved in the Codex Lunaros, describes a farmer from the town of Celero, who slit his own ears after waking 7 nights in a row to the sound of a voice humming beneath his floorboards. He said he recognized the tune was the same one his mother sang before she hanged herself 30 years prior. When the Vatican sent envoys to silence these rumors, most reports vanished. But one survived, smuggled out by a penitent scribe. It contains a drawing, shaky, ink-smeared, but unmistakable. The statue had returned. Not in stone this time, but in bark. A tree hollowed and twisted into the exact shape of La Madre Ascoltante, with sap that ran clear as tears. Beneath its roots, the soil was warm, and buried in that warmth, they claimed, were toys dolls, carved teeth, and one tiny porcelain shoe cracked down the middle. So the question that haunted the Holy Office was no longer what happened to Valdombra, but rather, where will she appear next? And more importantly, what happens when she chooses to listen again? They tried to bury her, not with soil or salt, but with silence. The church, fearing what they could not name, did what they had always done with things too vast to sanctify and too old to kill. They rewrote the story. Valdombra became a myth, a cautionary tale whispered to young clerics over flickering candles, a village cursed by its own sin. Convenient, safe, forgettable. But the listening mother does not feed on sin. She feeds on memory. And memory, no matter how tightly sealed, always seeps. By 1625, strange events began surfacing across the Papal States. Small, disjointed, but consistent as, if a thread once cut, had begun to unravel one strand at a time. In the town of San Fidele, a bell tower rang 13 times at midnight, though no one pulled the rope, and no 13th hour exists. The parish priest hanged himself the following morning, written on the chapel wall in his own blood. She is under the altar. She is listening again. In Avellino, a convent reported a statue of the Virgin that slowly turned its head toward the wall during evening prayers. When the nuns finally moved it, they discovered a second face carved into the bacillus. Mouthless, but weeping clear resin that smelled faintly of lilies and decay. And in Monte Rupo, children began to vanish. Not all at once, but gradually. Like leaves falling from a tree no one noticed was dying, their beds untouched, doors locked. Only a thin trail of salt each time, leading toward the forest. When villagers followed the trails, they always ended the same way. At a dry well, no rope, no bucket. Just a faint humming echoing upward from the dark. By then, the Holy Office had fractured. Some refused to speak of her. Others, gripped by guilt or awe, began to worship in secret. They wore veils, fasted from sound, and buried small statues in earth salted with tears. They called her not a demon, nor a saint, but the one who remembers us when God cannot. Among these heretics was Cardinal Raphael d'Arcangelo, a man once whispered to be papabile, destined for the throne of Peter. He disappeared in late autumn of that year. Days later, his study was found abandoned walls covered in looping spirals, and in the center an altar carved from human femurs. On it, a single phrase repeated over and over. We made her when we left the silences between prayers too long. That winter, something impossible happened. A traveling scholar named Iskandar Vale, fluent in 10 dead languages and known for cataloging the forbidden, claimed he had located what he called a pre-Christian text that describes her in detail. It was carved not on parchment, but on bond-12 flat ribs strung together with sinew. He found them, allegedly, beneath a ruined monastery in the Swiss Alps, walled behind bricks that bled when broken. The text spoke of a mother of listening, born not of flesh, but of neglect. A thing that emerges in places where sorrow was never spoken aloud, where children cried in rooms no one entered, where the dying whispered final words to ceilings. It is in that stillness, that unguarded pause between human voices, that she forms first as ache, then as echo, then as shape. She does not hunt, the bones red, but waits. 8. It is unclear whether Vale survived his discovery. His final letter, addressed to a fellow scholar, arrived torn, the ink blurred by what appeared to be seawater. The only legible sentence was, "Do not speak in empty churches." From here, the pattern grows darker still. An entire nunnery near Spoleto fell silent in 1626, when investigators arrived. They found the building intact, the candles lit, the doors unlocked. But every nun sat perfectly still in her pool life, breathing but mute, eyes wide, hands pressed to their ears. None have spoken since, and in the Vatican itself, a low hum began to emanate from beneath the apostolic library. Engineers were summoned. They tore up tiles, drilled into walls, searched for pipes or pests or rot. Nothing. The sound persisted. It was not mechanical. It was a nota, single, sustained tone, like someone humming from the depths of a well. The Pope, now aged and half-blind, refused to speak of it. But he was seen walking barefoot through the halls at night, scattering salt and muttering the Lord's Prayer backward. On his deathbed, he reportedly whispered, "We made her when we stopped listening to each other. It is not madness, not hysteria. No plague spreads through so many towns without leaving corpses. No hallucination echoes across languages, symbols, and centuries. This is a pattern, a presence that feeds not on blood, but on what we abandon in silence. The forgotten prayer, the ignored cry, the unanswered question." Valdombra was not the beginning. It was simply the first place she chose to stand upright. And now, she is listening again. The final known mention of La Madre Ascoltante in official church documents appears in a restricted memorandum dated October 8, 1628. Locked within the Ark of M. Secretum and marked with the seal of Invisibilis Custodia classification, reserved for relics and events incomprehensible, contagious, and self-replicating. The memorandum is unsigned, but scholars believe it was penned by Benedetto Salviati, a theologian once tasked with debunking false miracles. Salviati had a mind sharpened by reason and dulled by grief. He had lost both wife and daughter to the plague, and in his writings, he often spoke of God as an empty chair in a locked room. He never believed in the listening mother till she came for him. The memorandum tells of a village in southern France, Chavers, Surlac, placed not unlike Valdombra. Small, isolated, folded into hills like a forgotten bookmark in a Bible no longer read. The people there had stopped attending Mass, not out of heresy, but habit. The church bell had rusted. Confessional had become a storeroom for hay. Prayers, once said aloud, were now murmured quickly, distractedly, if at all. And then the well began to hum. It started as a low murmur like wind caught in a hollow pipe, but by the third night the tone deepened. It became a note with presence, like the breath of a throatless singer. Children would wake weeping, claiming they saw a tall woman walking across the ceiling, her feet never touching floorboards, her veil moving as if underwater. Salviati, dispatched by the church to assess the spiritual corrosion, arrived in Chavers 2 days later. He noted the air was unusually damp, though it had not rained. Salt bloomed at the edges of windows. The well itself was dry but still hummed on. When he lowered a weighted rope into its mouth, the rope came back wet. He burned the rope that evening. Villagers refused to speak. They merely watched, silent and distant, their mouths curling slightly not in welcome but in resignation, as if they knew that by the time a priest arrives, it is already far too late. That night, Salviati made his confession aloud, not to a priest, but to the empty church. He confessed doubt, neglect, the names he forgot to remember, the cries he ignored when his daughter was dying, the way he fell silent and let death take her alone. And when he finished, the candles in the nave lit themselves. The pews were empty, but every seat bore a shadow. And behind the altar, where once a cross hung, there now stood her. La Madre Ascoltante. No face, no voice, just that terrible, unbearable stillness. The child in her arms was no longer a doll or sculpture it breathed, its chest rising gently, eyes shut as if dreaming something ancient and unkind. Salviati wrote only one more sentence in his memorandum. "She is not here to punish you. She is here to hear the things we refuse to say out loud." He vanished the next morning. No body, no blood, just a single footprint burned into the stone floor of the church, shaped not like a human heel, but a spiral, curling inward, endlessly inward. Since then, the Vatican has adopted unofficial protocols. Empty wells are to be sealed. Any statue found with veils or missing faces must be destroyed by fire and not be touched directly. Churches without active congregations are to be deconsecrated and collapsed. Monasteries that fall silent for longer than 3 weeks are to be salted, their bells melted, their soil turned. But such measures are desperate stitches on a garment already unraveling. Today, in parts of Europe, locals still leave bowls of salt on windowsills. Some say, if you dream of a woman standing behind your bed, humming gently, you must wake yourself before she stops. Never let her finish the lullaby. Never let her reach the crib. Never turn around if you hear weeping from beneath floorboards that were never hollow. Because if you do, you may find she is already listening. And once she listens, she remembers. She remembers what you forgot, the apology you never spoke, the child you never held, the scream you muffled beneath your breath, because it was too inconvenient. She remembers the silences between words and the ache between sentences, and the long gray pauses in your life where grief was too tired to grieve. And when she remembers enough, she comes, not with wrath, not with fire, just a soft, wet hush, like the sea in your lungs. And by morning, the village will be gone, just as Valdombra was. And in its place, only salt.
Learn a letter.